Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. The first 4 years of my life were spent in Topeka, Kansas, and then the next 9 years I lived in Hutchinson, Kansas. Now, our house in Hutchinson had a basement, and I remember on many occasions having to go downstairs in the middle of the night because of a nearby tornado or the threat of a tornado. Of course, when one thinks of Kansas and tornadoes, the movie The Wizard of Oz comes to mind, of course. And on a side note, in my first ministry position, we lived in Liberal, Kansas. That's in the southwest corner of the state. And that's where my then teenage daughter was a Dorothy tour guide at the local Dorothy's House and Wizard of Oz Museum. Well, I don't think there's any place to live in the United States that's safe from all natural disasters. Here in Arkansas, tornadoes and floods are the two biggest threats. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we had tornadoes in the northwest part of our state that did some terrific damage. Other areas of the country are more concerned with hurricanes or earthquakes, drought, landslides, sinkholes, or wildfires. The first recorded natural disaster is the Great Flood, recorded in the Bible. Now, it and the subsequent story is recorded in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. Do you find it interesting that such a cataclysmic event that wiped out almost all of humanity, almost all the animals, it's the theme for so many baby nurseries? Well, this week we aren't looking at the flood story, but God's promise after the flood as we continue in the unit that's called Promises We Can Count On. This is the second lesson called God's Promise of Preservation. The focal passage is out of Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 13, and the point is God's promise to preserve his creation. Now, a Bible trivia question you might ask the class is, what were the names of Noah's three sons? And of course the answer is Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Noah's wife and Noah's daughter-in-laws are mentioned, but not named. Okay. You also might ask if anyone has ever been to the Ark encounter there in northern Kentucky and have them share their experience. Well, our first set of scriptures is Genesis 9, 1 through 3. When Noah and his family came out of the ark, it was like God was starting all over with the human race. That's why when we read these verses, we see some similarities to last week's scripture about creation. One similarity I see is that in the creation story, water covered the earth before God separated water from the dry land. Now, in the Noah story, what happened? Of course, water covered the earth. I don't think I've ever thought about that similarity before studying for this lesson. Another connection is that we see the command, be fruitful and multiply, or be fruitful and increase in number. And even though that command is given both in Genesis 1 and Genesis 9, I wonder if there's any significance to the fact that in Genesis 1:28, God gave the command to Adam and Eve. He gave it to them. But here in Genesis 9, God only told this to Noah and his three sons, just the men. It's probably no significance, but I find these little kind of details interesting. Well, we see some other differences between Genesis 1 and Genesis 9. With Adam and Eve, God told them that they would have dominion over all the animals. But God told Noah that the animals would, from then on, fear humans. This suggests that before the flood, humans and animals had more of a cooperative relationship. It also explains, or helps explain, how getting lions and tigers and bears, oh my, there's another Wizard of Oz reference. Getting them together in the ark was not that big of a problem. That adversarial relationship between humans and animals had not yet begun. Also before the flood, humans were given just plants for food. But now they're also given animals as food as well, which may be one of the reasons that animals would now fear people. Now, remember in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were given every plant for food, but there was a restriction, right? The tree of knowledge of good and evil. In this week's text, humans are given all animals, but there's a stipulation. So we're going to read about that in our next set of verses. That's verses 4 through 7 of Genesis 9. So at this point, there aren't any restrictions on clean and unclean animals. That's going to come later with the giving of the law to Moses. So at this time, catfish and pork were A-okay to eat. The limitation had to do with consuming blood. Now, this has nothing to do with you're not eating a medium rare steak. Almost all blood is drained from meat during the slaughtering process. The red liquid you see seeping out on your plate is not blood. It's a protein called myoglobin, and it's mixed with a little bit of water. But I know people like my wife are still never going to order anything other than well-done meat because they don't like blood on their plate. But that's okay. You see, this respect for blood is the first step, I believe, in establishing the symbolism of Christ's sacrifice for us on the cross. In Leviticus 17:14, God said that life is in the blood. We know that the wages of sin is death, so to pay for sin, blood had to be shed. Animals were sacrificed to atone for sin, and ultimately, then Jesus shed his blood as a payment for our sin debt. So this whole series of thought originated back in Genesis when God commanded a respect for blood. All human life is precious to God. Many of you know about my mother. She's been in a nursing home for right at 1 year. In fact, it was exactly a year ago on Saturday, on June 1st. She went in for rehab after breaking a leg, and physically, she's been steadily going downhill. Sometimes I can barely hear her speak when I visit. Have a hard time waking her up sometimes. I have to put my head down next to her mouth, so I can only barely understand her, and sometimes only maybe 50% of what she's saying. You know, she's not a productive member of society. But her life is still precious to God, and she needs to be treated with the dignity that God demands. Now, my brother and his wife have an adopted son with cerebral palsy. At 9 years old, he can't walk, he can't talk. He does communicate some. His entire life is spent either in a wheelchair, in the bed, or stretched out on the floor. He's not a productive member of society. But his life is still precious to God, and he needs to be treated with the dignity that God demands. Life has to be respected, even when butchering an animal for consumption. But it's not just the blood of animals that's special. The lifeblood of people is even more sacred because people were created in the image of God, as we talked about last week. God said he demanded an accounting for every human life that's taken, whether that be by an animal or by another human. In Exodus 21:28, it states that if a bull gores and kills someone, that animal is to be put to death, and its meat is not to be eaten. And we see this practice is still going on. Just a few months ago, a mountain lion killed a 21-year-old man and badly wounded his younger brother in Northern California. And that animal was euthanized. In verse 7, God repeated the command he gave in verse 1, be fruitful and increase in number. Well, our last set of verses is Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 13, and here we get to the promise or the covenant of God. Now, there are two types of covenants in the Bible. There's a conditional and an unconditional covenant. A conditional covenant states that a promise will be kept if certain conditions are met. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 28, Leviticus chapter 26, they are full of examples of God saying, if you will do this, then I will do this. A secular example would be like if a parent promises to pay for their child's college education if they maintain a B average. But once that average goes to 2.999, the funds are cut off. An unconditional covenant is one that requires nothing of the party being given the promise. It would be like a parent promising to pay for the child's college education with no stipulations. It wouldn't matter what the GPA was. It wouldn't matter the child's behavior. They would pay for the college regardless. Well, in this passage, God makes an unconditional covenant, not only with Noah, but with his descendants and the animals. Never again would life be destroyed by a worldwide flood. Now, of course, we've had floods. 89 people died in August of 2005 as a result of the levee failures in the New Orleans area after Hurricane Katrina. In the 1930s, as many as 5 million Chinese died as a result of flooding. Millions have died around the world and throughout time in floods, but there has never been a worldwide flood since Noah. In fact, God emphatically stated 3 times that there would never be another worldwide flood. You see it twice in verse 11 and then once down in verse 15. God didn't promise there wouldn't ever be another flood, just that there wouldn't be a worldwide flood. Well, there will be another calamity to destroy the earth, but it won't be a flood. It'll be fire. We see that in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 12 at the end of time. Then God told Noah that there would be a sign of the covenant, that is a visible sign that the promise was valid and it was still in effect. And that sign of the covenant would be a rainbow. Now, we know that a rainbow is not some magical finger painting of God in the sky. Rainbows are created when sunlight, which is white light, it passes through water droplets and it's bent or refracted and split into the 7 colors of the rainbow. I believe that God used the scientific principles associated with light refraction to serve as an illustration for mankind. The word rainbow in Hebrew is really just bow or war bow, like a bow and arrow that's used in battle. Now, it's interesting that the arc of the bow, this arc, is pointed toward heaven, like a person would hold the bow. The way that a warrior would signify to his enemy that he's putting down his weapon, that he's declaring peace. So could it be that God was possibly indicating that the war, the flood, it was over, and that God was declaring peace by promising never to do it again? That's what a lot of Jewish scholars believe. Well, what are some takeaways from this week's lesson? First of all, let's be advocates for life, regardless of age, whether that's elderly, preborn, whether the mental or physical capacity, regardless of where that is on the spectrum. Another thing is, even though you may disagree with someone else's philosophy or theology or even life choices, that's not a reason to demonize them. Let's treat people with respect. They too are created in the image of God. And kind of along those same lines, a person's race or nationality does not indicate their proclivity to crime or violence. Now, similar to last week's lesson, the call to be fruitful and multiply can be seen as being responsible stewards of the earth. Now, if you're really brave, you could look into the rainbow flag, what that means today, how the rainbow symbol has been stolen. You might even look into, depending on your class, you know your class better and you don't want to get into an argument, but you might even discuss the death penalty. Talk about that. So anyway, there you have it. Next week, we're going to be looking at Genesis 12, 15, and 17. Not all 3 chapters, but various verses out of that, looking at God's promise of blessing. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really do. I really do appreciate you and your comments. Don't forget to continue to pray for and with your class.